What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Young Guns podcast. And finally, Alex Debrincat has finally been traded from the Ottawa Senators to the Detroit Red Wings. And actually, this deal actually includes multiple parts to this. So obviously, Alex Debrincat goes from Ottawa to Detroit. He signs a 4-year, $7.875 million contract with the Detroit Red Wings. And in exchange, the Detroit Red Wings send Dominik Kubalik, defenseman prospect, Donovan Sebrango, a conditional 2024 first-round pick, and a 2024 fourth-round pick going to the Ottawa Senators. Detroit also has the option to send either their first or Boston's first. And then the other conditions include if Boston's pick is in the top 10, Boston will have an option to retain it and send a 2025 first to Detroit. Then Detroit has the option to send Detroit's 2024 first or Boston's 2025 first. So that is the difference between the two. Now, just to continue a little bit, obviously we knew with Alex Debrincat, the big thing around him was the fact that he wasn't going to re-sign in Ottawa. There was a lot of talk about how he didn't want to be there and he didn't want to sign a long-term deal. And I think there was a lot of expectation that he was likely going to end up in Detroit. There was rumors, surrounding him to Detroit, considering the fact that he is from Michigan. But Debrincat, who was drafted in the second round, 39th overall in 2016 NHL entry draft, played one season with the Ottawa Senators in which he was traded for a first, a second, and a third. So the Senators don't get the same amount of value back, considering that was a pretty high pick at the time. I believe it was seventh overall at the time. So Ottawa don't get the same amount of value back, but they still get a decent return. It's a better return than I think a lot of people give Ottawa credit for. But obviously, we have Zach on the podcast, and obviously Zach is a Senators fan. So Zach is going to give us his opinion on this deal. And obviously, he wanted Debrincat to stay in Ottawa. So Zach, hearing this news right now, what are your thoughts on Debrincat moving from Ottawa to Detroit?
Well, I think with the term that Detroit offered and the AAV of which is 7.8 million, it looks like they got him for a bargain. And that makes me believe that he just didn't want to stay playing in Ottawa, maybe not playing in Canada, period. And the Sens do get an interesting return, but it's definitely not as big as a return as I think they should have received for him, especially considering that he's coming from a direct division rival. I would have probably liked to see something along the lines of the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade just because of the status of the player. So to me, it's two roster players that could help Ottawa right now, and that's what they need. And a second-round pick, and maybe you add the prospect in there. But right now what they're getting is, and it's confirmed, is Dominik Kubalik, who is a natural center who played on the wing all of last year for Detroit, who's going to be a nice, maybe second line or middle six add for the Sens, who gives them a nice little roster boost. They're getting the prospect who was a third-round pick back in 2020, who spent some time, Sebrango, here we see it in the ECHL last year and also in Grand Rapids, their American Hockey League affiliate. Not too much promise with him, and they get a first-round pick, which is conditional as to which is going to be the worst pick. So it could end up being a pick that's just outside of the top 10 or a late 20s pick, most likely depending on how Boston finished this year. So overall, I'm not the biggest fan of it, but I do give Pierre Dorion some credit because given the circumstance with the player, they do get a roster player in return and potentially a nice first-round pick, so I'm not too upset about it.
And the other thing too, right, is so we look at Debrincat and kind of his statistics with the Ottawa Senators. Last year he played 82 games, scored 27 goals, 39 assists for 66 points. Obviously, a lot of that was playing alongside of, I believe it was Shane Pinto.
Shane Pinto and Drake Batherson.
That's it. So he was playing alongside Drake Batherson and Shane Pinto for most of the season. So, he still put up 27 goals. Obviously, it wasn't where I think Ottawa expected him to be in terms of the points. But I think the expectation for Debrincat was that slowly, he was going to work his way up and become a star player in Ottawa. And I just don't think that, I think maybe he just didn't want it. There's a lot of factors to it. I don't know why he didn't specifically want to stay in Ottawa. I think they're a young and promising team that I think could have used a player like Debrincat, especially in the long term. So I'm kind of surprised about that. But, I think for Detroit, what they're getting is they're getting a guy who can score 25 plus goals. He's hit 41 twice in his career. He's a guy who can score 30 goals as well. So they're getting a goal scorer in Alex Debrincat, and they're getting a goal scorer that's going to help them win games that I think last year they weren't going to be able to win. So I think for Debrincat, it's a good move for Detroit. It's a good ad. They get him on a good deal as well. 7.875 for 4 years, I think, is a pretty good deal. It puts him until he's 29, which means he'll be able to sign another potential 8-year extension, either with the Red Wings or potentially with somebody else in 4 years' time. Now, for Dominik Kubalik. Now, Kubalik's an interesting one because he actually played with Debrincat in Chicago. But he's an interesting one because he kind of came out a little bit under the radar in his rookie season in 1920, where he scored 30 goals in 68 games. And everyone kind of had this expectation.
2020.
2019, 2020. Sorry, my bad. And he scored 30 goals, in 68 games. And everyone kind of expected him to, be this guy that was going to be a consistent 30 goal scorer. But then the last 3 seasons, he never really hit those feet. However, he has scored 17 goals and he has scored 15 goals playing on what looks like for a lot of teams on a middle 6 role, right? So kind of like what Zach mentioned, either in a top 6 role or a middle 6 role. I think Kubalik in this situation, obviously he's penciled in on the first line here in Detroit, but if you go to the Ottawa Senators lines on where they have currently, I think there's a possibility here that with Josh Norris coming back and likely Pinto being the 3C, that you can throw Kubalik on that second line where Debrincat was, and he can potentially still find a scoring touch. I mean, look, if you look at Ottawa's top 6 right now, this is obviously with Josh Norris with the expectation that he'll be healthy. You have Brady Tkachuk, Tim Stützle, Claude Giroux, and then your second line is potentially Dominik Kubalik, Josh Norris, and Drake Batherson, and your third line could either be Ridley Gregg, Shane Pinto, and Matthew Joseph. Now, what's interesting about this as well is that there's rumors that the Senators want to also go after Vladimir Tarasenko, and that apparently they've shown interest in Tarasenko. And if they can get Tarasenko locked up, that could be a whole different conversation as to what the Senators could look like for next year. So I think personally, based on this, I think Kubalik's a good ad for the Senators. I think he's going to provide, a little bit more of a different dynamic compared to Debrincat. He's a guy that can put the puck in the net. He's a guy that's very streaky. So when he scores in bunches. But not only that, he's a player that is also good at both ends of the ice. He's a very good defensive player. He's a guy that can play both ends of the ice. And he's a guy that in the playoffs, which the Ottawa Senators are obviously hoping to reach at some point this season, they're hoping that if they get there, well, he's a playoff performer. He scored 4 goals, 4 assists in 9 playoff games during the bubble season. So there is potential there for the Senators. And obviously with Donovan Sebrango, it's unsure about what type of prospect he's going to be. He's a 3rd-round pick, in 63rd overall in the 2020 draft. Hasn't really hit his pro level by storm, but maybe there's an expectation that if he goes to Belleville next year, and he could turn things around, and maybe he'll be a promising prospect. But obviously for Ottawa, I think the main pieces in this deal are going to include Dominik Kubalik and obviously the conditional first. And if you look at Kubalik just quickly before we continue, and just to get more of Zach's opinion, Kubalik's deal is actually one that is expiring at the end of the year. So this is kind of an interesting one for Ottawa because he's making only $2.5 million. So for him, if this guy comes in and scores another 40 points or 50 points this year, you may be able to get Kubalik on a cheap deal. Maybe you might get him at $3-4 million. So for Ottawa, they're getting a guy who's 2 years older, but who's making significantly less than what Alex Debrincat would have made had he played or had he signed an extension with the Senators. So there is that to take into consideration as well when looking at Dominik Kubalik's contract. So, yeah. And Zach, just for you, obviously, so, you look at Ottawa, and you look at Detroit, and obviously just seeing where Ottawa is right now and looking at this roster just forward-wise. Is there a potential to potentially add another top 6 forward to this and maybe throw Kubalik down to the top 9 with Shane Pinto and likely Matthew Joseph? Or do you think that Ottawa probably sticks with this forward core for the time being?
I don't think Pierre Dorion is done making moves. Obviously, for the next year or two at least, they'll have the wiggle room to add nice depth pieces on, well, more secondary scoring pieces on short-term deals. Like you mentioned, Kubalik is signed for another 2 years at a very nice cap hit. And there's
Actually, he's
also the
got one more
rumor
year
of
left. He's
one
got
more
one more year
year.
left.
So there's that, and there's the rumors of Vladimir Tarasenko, who was apparently very close to signing with the Islanders. A lot of people thought that that deal was going to be locked and sealed by now, but it hasn't been. And the reason being, according to a lot of renowned analysts, is that Ottawa offered him more money, and he is willing to play the waiting game, and he has played the waiting game for Alex Debrincat to get moved, frees up the cap space for Ottawa, and now let's see what happens. I'd really like for them to add a player like Vladimir Tarasenko because, yes, if you look at the roster top to bottom, their top 6, it looks like they're not suffering, and they'd still be one of the more lethal top 6s in the league. But you add a player like Tarasenko, and you replace that dynamic ability that Alex Debrincat had, and it's also worth mentioning that a good chunk of his goals this past year were on the power play. He was a big threat with his shot on the power play, and you get a lot of those same qualities back with Vladimir Tarasenko. And also for the player Debrincat himself, what I wanted to add is that the plus side for him is that he's signing a 4-year deal, and that by the time the deal expires, he'll be 28, 29, and he'll be due for another big paycheck once he hits unrestricted free agency. And for now, he's going back to a hometown team. That was his destination of choice, as it looks like. But he's going to a worse hockey club at the moment because, let's be honest, Detroit are 5 years behind what Ottawa are at right now with the rebuild. Ottawa are done the rebuilding phase and are ready to compete, and Detroit have some cornerstone pieces, but don't have the same infrastructure that Ottawa have right now. So it's interesting to see how he chose to go there, considering that he'd have a better opportunity to compete in Ottawa. But for me, it boils down to, did he like playing for DJ Smith, the coach? If you listen to his last presser of the regular season, he was saying that coach, not directly addressing Coach DJ Smith, but saying regarding his future that, look, I want to come back, but I want to see what the ownership is going to do. And the new ownership group, what they've done is retain Pierre Dorion and DJ Smith for another year. So there's that fact to consider too.
Yeah, and obviously for Debrincat, he's going to be leaving an Ottawa Senators team that's very offensively minded, or very offensive, pretty good offensive team, to go to a team in Detroit that isn't really built on their offense, right? If you look at their defense, they've added guys on defense, and I think in net they're pretty good as well with Ville Husso and James Reimer. But this isn't a team that screams wow to me. Right, you look at the first line, and obviously it's really good. Lucas Raymond, Dylan Larkin, and now it's going to be Alex Debrincat that's going to be on that right wing. And then your second line is Jonathan Bergeron, JT Compher, and David Perron. Your third line is Robbie Fabry, Andrew Kopp, and Daniel Sprung. And then your fourth line is Christian Fischer, Michael Rasmussen, and Klim Kostin. Detroit have depth. They do have depth. They have depth across all their lineups, but they don't have a real true top 6, and I don't think they really have a true top 9 either. So just in terms of those two things, I would say for Detroit, it really comes down to, are they relying solely on the fact that Debrincat is going to be, this 40-goal guy? And if he's going to be the 40-goal guy in Detroit, I think that there's going to be a really good opportunity for him to reach that level. I think Detroit could be really happy about that. But we'll see what happens with Detroit. Just quickly before we end the video, Dominik Kubalik, look at his. If you look at his player card, he's acquired by Ottawa as a middle 6 scoring winger who takes a lot of one-timers. So if you look at him, he's probably evenly balanced in his even strength offense and defense. He's a guy that does well, obviously on the power play as well. Not really much of a penalty killer, but also draws a decent amount of penalties, and his goals per 60 are pretty good. And then just obviously, if you scroll down a little bit more, we'll be able to see Alex Debrincat's player card. And obviously, we all know how elite Debrincat is, and just the quality that goes into Alex Debrincat. So if you just quickly look over here, his 92% war percentage. Obviously, he's an offensive dynamo, not really the best defensively, but again, power play specialist as well. And he's a scoring winger with an excellent track record of creating and finishing chances at a high level, coming with an offseason Ottawa. But no, his scoring wasn't just a product of playing with Kane, underrated passing too. So we obviously know Brinket's the full package. I think Detroit's getting themselves a real good player here. And I think it's a player that wanted to play in Detroit. So I think going back home for him is important, and we'll see what happens. In my opinion, and Zach, we're going to ask you this before we end off. In my opinion, I think Detroit wins this deal simply for the fact that they get the better player and they get an elite, talented player. Zach, what are your thoughts? Who do you think wins this deal as of right now? And do you think that Ottawa is either has improved or gotten worse?
Well, if I'm speaking honestly, I think Detroit did win this trade. They get the better player, a player who's going to most definitely be back to his 40 goal a season scoring ways. Listen, if you look at his numbers in Ottawa, it's 66 points and 27 goals, but that's primarily operating on the second line. And with a new team, and there's the familiarity aspect, he's a player who likes to shoot the puck, and his shooting percentage was down at an irregular rate compared to previous seasons. And he just wasn't getting the puck luck that he was usually getting in Chicago. And I think had he spent another year in Ottawa, I think he would have at least been back to the 35 goal, 40 goal caliber player that he is. And now Detroit are going to be reaping the rewards getting this great player. So I do think that Detroit win this one.
Alrighty, and obviously for us, so guys, thank you for watching. Leave a like if you really like the video. Obviously, don't forget to subscribe as well. And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next episode of the Young Guns podcast. Thank you very much for watching.
Peace.
Peace.